Okay, last year, January the 20th, I started preaching on TikTok, and I did 5 3-minute sessions, and I started in the Gospels. And I covered the entire New Testament, and then I did Daniel and the 12 minor prophets and the major prophets. And then I went to Genesis and started in Genesis and went through the Exodus and Kings and Chronicles and all the Judges. We covered all that already. So I've covered the entire Bible on TikTok. Now, I want to do this Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was in the Bible for over 1,000 years. It's got 400 and something pages that the Pope decanonized. He decided that they weren't good enough to be in the Bible anymore. And so in 1649, the Pope decanonized, or he removed these books from the Bible that had been in the Bible for over 1,000 years. The women heroes of the Bible. Now, part of the book of Esther is still left in the Bible, and the other half of the book of Esther, we're going to cover it here shortly. And let me read the preface. This guy here, his name is, it's the Apocrypha translated by Edgar Goodspeed. And he's one of the best. This is supposed to be the best Apocrypha, the Goodspeed. Now, this is his preface telling you what went on. The Apocrypha formed in an integral part of King James Version. In 1611, King James of England hired scribes to translate the Bible into English. Old English, with the thys and the mys, and it's real hard to read, but it's the original King James Version of the Bible. Now, the 1611 version of the Bible has the Apocrypha in it, but then in 1649, it was removed out of all the Bibles after that. So, part of the King James Version of 1611 is they had all the preceding English versions from their beginning in 1382, but they are seldom printed as part of any longer. Still more seldom as part of the English Revised Version, and were not included in the American revision. This is partly because the Puritans disapproved of them. They had already begun to drop them from the printing of the Geneva Bible by 1600 and began to demand copies of the King James Version, omitting them as early as 1629. And it is partly because we moderns discredit them because they did not form part of the Hebrew Bible, and most of them have never been found in any Hebrew forms at all. But they were part of the Bible of the early church, for it is used in the Greek version of the Jewish Bible, which we call the Septuagint, and these books were all in that version. They passed from it into Latin, and the great Latin Bible, edited by St. Jerome around AD 400, the Vulgate, which became the authorized Bible of Western Europe and England, and remained so for 1,000 years. But Jerome found that they were not in the Hebrew Bible, so he called them the Apocrypha, or hidden or secret books. It must not be supposed, however, that Jerome gathered them into a group and put them into the end of his Old Testament version. On the contrary, they are scattered here and there through the Vulgate, just as they are through the Greek Bible. They are also scattered through the versions made from the Vulgate, the Wycliffe Curry English translation, and the Old German Bible, both products of the 14th century. It remained for Luther to take the hint Jerome had dropped 1,100 years before and to separate them in his German Bible of 1534 from the rest of the Old Testament and put them after it. This course was followed the next year by Coverdale in the first printed English Bible of 1535, and the English Authorized Bibles, the Great Bible, the Bishops, and the King James all followed the same course. The Catholic English Old Testament of 1610, however, followed the Vulgate arrangement and left them scattered among the books which we include in our Old Testament. It still contains them, but on the Protestant side, both British and American Bible societies more than 100 years ago, 1827, took a definite stand against their publication, excuse me, and they have since almost disappeared. Great values reside in the Apocrypha. The Prayer of Manasseh is a noticeable piece of liturgy, and First Maccabees is of great historical value for its story of Judaism in the 2nd century before Christ, the heroic days of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers when Pharmacium had its rise. The additions to Esther impart a religious color to the romantic story. Judith, Susanna, and Tobit, while fascinating pieces of fiction, were meant by their writers to teach important lessons to their contemporaries. Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus are among the masterpieces of the Jewish sages. But to us, this appendix of the Old Testament is important as forming a very necessary link between the Old Testament and the New. And if we had no Old Testament at all, the Apocrypha would still be indispensable to the student of the New Testament, of which it forms the prelude and background. This is why I have prepared an American translation of the Apocrypha to complete our American translation of the Bible and to make its various books more intelligibly accessible to college and university students and to the general reader. The strong contrast they present in sheer moral values to the New Testament is most instructive, and they form an indispensable part of the historic Christian Bible as it is known in the ancient Greek and Latin churches in the Reformation and the Renaissance, and in all authorized English Bibles, Catholic and Protestant. Now, this is the preface of Edgar Goodspeed. Now you got the contents. The first book of Esdras. Now Esdras in the Hebrew, that's Ezra. Ezra the priest. Now Ezra and Nehemiah came back. Ezra rebuilt the temple, and then Nehemiah rebuilt the walls and the gates. Okay, after the 70-year captivity. And Cyrus the Great gave them a bunch of the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple, there at Solomon's temple. When he came to Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar stole a bunch of the gold and silver and all the stuff that was in the temple, there, Solomon's temple. And Ezra brought a bunch of it back because Cyrus the Great gave it to him. Because Cyrus the Great said that God gave him victory and that God needed his place to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, a place for study. And now you got the second book of Esdras, a book of Tobit, a book of Judith, the additions of the book of Esther, the second half of the book of Esther. Half of the Esther is in the Bible, even to this day. We've already studied half the book of Esther, and then we're going to read the other half of the book of Esther. The wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Sirach, the book of Baruch, the story of Susanna, the song of the three children, the story of Bel and the dragon, and the prayer of Manasseh, and the first book of Maccabees, and the second book of Maccabees. Now that's what's going to be in the Apocrypha. Now, we're going to start out the first book of Esdras. This book produces the substance of the end of the Second Chronicles and the whole of Ezra and part of Nehemiah. In the Septuagint, where Ezra and Nehemiah are called 1 and 2 Esdras, this book is called Third Esdras, or by modern scholars, the Greek Ezra. But it is placed before the other two in Josephus' account of the period